everybody. I hope you're doing really, really awesome. I am so excited about your projects and where everything is going. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to really turn our attention to developing and building the content of your hat projects. But before we get there, we have one last content area to cover, and that's this idea of evaluation. Now, we won't be spending an enormous amount of time on this idea of evaluation. In fact, when we get to the end of the slides here today, you're going to see that this particular assignment is actually not a big scale assignment. It's just kind of the tip of the iceberg about evaluation for your hat. Now, why would that be? Many of you are going to go on from this class and you're going to have an entire course about the idea of evaluation as it relates to your training product. So here, what I want to do is just kind of introduce some basic ideas and some basic premises and some principles about evaluation so that you're really well prepped to move into that next class, that natural next step in your progress here in the college. So before we dive into content and developing that content, let's begin thinking about evaluation and what that is. So the very first natural question I think we might ask is, why evaluate? I mean, haven't you spent enough time on task analysis and needs analysis and learner analysis and writing objectives and all of that stuff? I mean, why would you need to evaluate here on the back end? I mean, don't you know, or don't you think that your training is going to work? You probably do. But the idea of evaluation is to move beyond thinking that your program or your training intervention worked and really finding the hard metrics to support the utility of your training in actual practice. So you're going to be able to demonstrate some things about what your learners really learned or what they really took away or how they reacted to your training. The idea of evaluation is not just one more thing, but really it is about providing solid evidence and data-driven decisions, right, around your training. And evidence around the evaluation can tell you what needs some tweaking, what needs some next steps. So the goal of evaluation is really to build a business case around data-driven decisions and this idea of evidence-based practice. Anything outside of evaluation that falls into categories of like, well, I think this worked, or I believe this worked, or I feel like this worked, isn't evidence-based at all. And we want to be able to make our decisions when it comes to building a case inside our organizations that we know our training works, that we know our intervention works, and that we have the evidence to back that up. One of the first things we need to think about before we move into this idea of evaluation is this idea of statistics, right? And so we have two questions here on our slides. The first is, well, what is reliability? And the second is, well, what is validity? And I might add a third here that says, well, what's the relationship between these things, right? So, but first, let's tackle the idea of reliability. So, if I was to ask you, what do you think reliability is all about? Well, it's getting colder outside, right? And so let's use an analogy of a car. Let's say we were going out and we were trying to start our car and our car battery didn't start today. We would say, wow, our car starting ignition is not very reliable, right? Some days it starts and some days it doesn't start. Reliability is doing something over and over and over, and the confidence that we have in something being accurate over and over and over and over again. If I go out and I put my key in the ignition, right, and I turn the ignition and the car starts, and it starts every time I put the key in the ignition, we know that that's a very reliable ignition system. We know that's a very reliable battery, right? The idea of validity is about, are we actually using the right key to start the car? So validity is measuring, or the idea of validity is measuring something that you intend to measure. So we're using the right key for the right ignition, right? And it turns the car. The key is valid for this vehicle. Maybe we go outside and we find we're not using the right key. I'm using my wife's key instead of my car key, and so it doesn't fit in the ignition. It's not a valid key for that ignition system, and so it doesn't start. Another example might be from a personal standpoint, the use of chocolate sauce, right? So let's think about this for a minute. So reliably, ladies and gentlemen, chocolate sauce is excellent, right? Many of us, we have kids at home, or maybe we like to have chocolate milk in the morning. And I love to put chocolate in my milk. I love to put it on my strawberries. I love to put it on my ice cream. I love to put it on brownies. I love to put it on pudding. I love chocolate sauce. Reliably, chocolate sauce is excellent, right? Well, what about steaks? Would you put chocolate on a steak, or would you put chocolate on broccoli? How about chocolate for salad dressing? Would chocolate work? Chocolate sauce work really well for salad dressing? No. So we would say that chocolate reliably is yummy. It's very tasty, right? But it's not. It's not a valid application on broccoli, or it's not a valid application on a steak, or it's not a valid application on salad, right? And so the next question we might ask here, the next series of questions we might ask is, well, can something be reliable and not valid? And can something be valid and not reliable? And you might be like, your head is hurting here now, right? Oh my gosh, what's going on here, right? And now there's always extremes here, and I would imagine people could post and give me a bunch of scenarios about, well, yes, something can always be reliable but not valid. Something can always be valid and not reliable. And let me give you just some general principles here of this, right? So the idea of reliability, right, is that something is consistent over time. Chocolate sauce is consistently good over time, but is not a valid salad dressing, right? If I go out and I use the wrong key in the ignition, and I go out and I use my wife's key every morning and it never fits in my car ignition, right? Reliably, I'm using the wrong thing. Reliably, I'm misapplying the idea of chocolate sauce. Well, can something be valid and not reliable? Well, let's see here. So, can chocolate sauce on ice cream be a valid use of something, right? Give a valid use of chocolate sauce, and it not be reliable. So the question here is, can you measure something well in the context of evaluation? Can you measure something validly, but not reliably? And the answer to that question is yes, right? So we can measure something validly, and we can measure it wrong, right? We can misapply something over and over and over and over again. So the answers to both of these questions is that yes, something can be reliable and not valid. Something can be consistently wrong all the time. And we can have a valid indicator of something, and it cannot be reliable, right? It can have bad psychometric properties. So we think we're measuring something, and we just need to tweak it because we need to apply it consistently across context in the same way all the time. So what does this mean for evaluation? Well, the first question is that we need to make sure that our instruments for evaluation are reliable, that they actually get results consistently over time. So the same way that chocolate sauce is reliably good, right, is the same way our any evaluation measure that we might use is reliably good, right? It's reliably high. Its reliability is high. And then the idea of validity here is that we're actually measuring what we intend to measure. We're evaluating someone on something that is a good indicator or a valid indicator of their performance. And we want to make sure that that reliability is very high, right? So the idea of evaluation here is that we want to at least take into context or think about the idea of reliability and validity. So let's move on. Enough of that statistic stuff. So remember this picture. We've looked at this picture before. Here's a bullseye, right? And we talked about bullseye in the context of instructional objective, which is exactly where we're going to go next. So if I was you, I would be asking myself, well, gosh, where do I even begin this idea of evaluation? I mean, where do I even start the conversation, right? And here's where you would start. The instructional objective. Remember, when we wrote our instructional objectives, our instructional objectives had 4 different parts, right? The last one being the evaluative component or the criteria, right? So if we break down this instructional objective, we would notice that at the end of this course, the learners will be able to label 3 major parts of the human heart using a composite map of the heart. So how would you evaluate this particular instructional objective? Well, let's think about it. Let's pretend for a minute that we're in medical school and we are specializing in cardiology, and our instructor gives us a test, and he asks us to label the three major parts of the human heart using a composite map. What if I only label two parts? Would you want a surgeon that can only label two parts? Gee, I don't think I would want that surgeon. What about one part? Or what if the surgeon labeled five parts? Well, he's just making parts up, right? She's just making parts up about things. The evaluative component here is that they need to be able to label three major parts of the heart, and they need to use a map to do that, right? And the map is supplied. The evaluative component here is not only the number, but it's the condition that we give it. It's being able to label the three parts using the map. Now, when it comes to instructional objectives, you have the power to really write in the evaluative component that you want. Here's the great news. You've already done the hard work, right? You've already written terminal and enabling objectives, and all you've got to do is go back and take a look at those. So if we move forward, the next thing we would need to think is like, all right, well, how do you know if your training has been successful? How do you know if you've actually succeeded? And there's this idea of summative and formative, right? Summative is kind of like the end of the training. It's like running a race, right? It's crossing the finish line and you get your final score. The idea of summative is this kind of summative ending evaluative place. The idea of formative evaluation is kind of like here and there, and it's, if we were using the analogy of a race, it's like each of the water stations, or if you were to clock every lap, right? We're getting formative information, we're getting formative evaluative information that allows us to know how we're doing in between, and then we can also do summative, which is what was my actual time in the race, right? So these two things are used kind of interconnectedly, and I would encourage you to take a look at your text to get some more specifics about this information. So let's kind of dive into the meat of the idea of evaluation as it relates to your training. So the first thing here is taking a look at knowledge, right? So many of you have instructional events or training events that are going to be really built around the idea of knowledge change, right? So we go back to our task analysis, we can look and we're asking people to kind of learn some information. So here's a question for you. Well, what would constitute a change in knowledge? How would you know? How would you be able to determine whether or not something constitutes a change in knowledge, right? What are some examples of what that might look like? Could it be like a history test or being able to label those three parts of the heart? I mean, what exactly would be the knowledge change here? Considering the perspective of evaluation, one thing to consider is, well, how would you actually determine if that change has happened for your learners? It's important to note here that our text would suggest that we often can use tests or quizzes for this. This is a very common application for knowledge evaluation. However, I would encourage you to take a closer look at page 143 of our text, and specifically the test prep plan. Now, this really gets into issues of validity and reliability, and there are some legal ramifications for this. If you give a quiz or you give a test, and the test isn't really a valid indicator of performance, yet it precludes people from being able to move on in promotion, or it precludes people from being hired into a job. We've got to be able to say that the test or the quiz that we use is a valid representation of the performance, and that it is reliable, and that it measures the performance consistently over time, over and over and over and over again. So we have to consider both validity and reliability in the test prep plan. If you are thinking about doing some kind of a knowledge change in your training, I would encourage you to take a look at page 143 of our text. The next idea is a skill change. So some of you have trainings and interventions that really constitute skill changes, behavioral changes, right? Like, I'm going to learn how to use a fire extinguisher. I'm going to learn how to operate on someone. I'm going to learn how to do something very specific. And when we say skill, it's oftentimes some kind of overt, something that we can see, it's tangible, and we're going to watch somebody do something, right? Considering the perspective of your evaluation, How would you determine if a change in skill has actually happened for your learners? What would a skill change be? And this is a question you would want to ask yourself and reflect on if you're focused on skill change. And the third and final component is attitude change. And this may be the most difficult of all because oftentimes we can use a test or a quiz to see if knowledge has been developed. We can actually ask someone to demonstrate something in terms of a skill change. But what about attitude? What constitutes a change in attitude, and how would you know? Considering the perspective of evaluation, how would you determine if a change in attitude has actually happened for your learners? What would you be able to determine? How would you know that? Is it that somebody would tell you something? Is it that they would demonstrate something? Is it a combination of those things? Something to really think about and reflect on as you think about, for those of you who have attitude built into your training and your training interventions, attitude is something that you want to spend some time kind of thinking about. All right, so you're probably asking yourself, all right, Brad, cut to the chase here, man. Let's wrap this up, right? And here's where you're gonna really want to spend your time, is at the 4 levels. So in terms of the specific assignment for this class, the 4 levels is kind of where it's at. Now, the 4 levels is something you're going to spend, as I mentioned, an enormous amount of time talking about in some future courses. But here, we're just kind of going to talk a little bit about these 4 levels and spend some time kind of diving into them. Now, your textbook gives some specific information about that, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. But let's take each one of the 4 levels separately. So level 1 is really about reaction. Some people call this level smile sheets, right? It's the immediate reaction that your learners have to your instruction. This level simply looks at how your learners react to what they have been a part of, to the instruction, right? It is sometimes you might get these at the end of an instructional event or a workshop, and you're asked to rate how was this information relevant to you? Was the presenter helpful? How likely are you to apply this information later? It really is just kind of your immediate first reaction. The second level, level 2, we call the learning level, right? And this looks at what knowledge, skills, or attitude actually changed. So this might be some kind of a knowledge check or a skill demonstration or some kind of attitude reflection where we ask people to kind of talk back to the class about what's changed for them or what might be a little bit different. So level 1 is the reaction, level 2 is the learning, and level 3 is the transfer. So it's really nice that people reacted well to your training. They loved you as a presenter, of course, and that they actually learned some knowledge or they're able to demonstrate the skill. The third level asks, does it actually translate back to the environment? So level 3 looks at what learners are actually using in their environment. Now this level takes a little extra effort, because we have to go back and we have to actually maybe observe our learners in their natural environment. We have to go look at them at their workplace. We have to go look at them wherever they might be to see, did these skills, did this knowledge, did these attitudes actually transfer back? So a customer service training that you're having, everybody loved the training. They learned the right technique for answering phones and making sure that customers are satisfied. When they get back to their job, does this actually transfer? So you go and you watch them and you find that, oh, geez, it didn't transfer very well. The skills that I taught them actually aren't being implemented on the job, right? Or perhaps they are. Perhaps everyone's using it really, really well. So the first level is reaction. The second level is learning. The third level is, does the knowledge, skill, or attitude actually transfer to the environment? And the fourth level is organizational results. Some people call this return on investment. This looks at the effectiveness of the training in business results. Does it actually make a difference to the business? Now, very few organizations do this because it is mathematically quite complicated. It can be quite complicated. It takes at times a lot of effort to do this kind of training. And so as a result of that, we reserve level 4 or organizational results for those trainings that we really invest appreciably in and that we need to kind of be able to say, Yes, this training has impacted the business at this level. There's a 182% return on investment for our training, right? For the purposes of this assignment, here's what I'd like for you to do. I'd like for you to brainstorm for each of the 4 levels how you would specifically evaluate your unique training intervention. So, what is it that you're going to be able to do to evaluate whether or not your learners, or whether or not, or how your learners reacted to your instruction? How would you know if they learned a knowledge, skill, or an attitude? How would you know if the information actually transferred back to the environment? And then level 4, how would you know if your training or your instructional event affected business results in some way? And I want you to just kind of brainstorm some ideas for level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Now, you're not actually going to do this. Remember, this is just a teaser for a class that will come in the future. But for right now, I want us to just do some brainstorming about what might be possible here for evaluation. So again, you're going to focus your time and energy on level 1. What's the reaction? So if you were going to evaluate the reaction, how would you do that? Would you develop some kind of a survey? Would you develop some kind of a sheet? Would you develop some kind of something you would put online and you would send to learners immediately after the training? How would you know if somebody learned something? How would you know if that skill actually transferred? And how would you know if your training impacted business results? That's it for evaluation. In the coming weeks, we're going to really turn some exciting energy towards the development of the actual content for our instruction, and we'll go from there. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great day.